you very much to you, Lakshman, for coming on to this podcast. It's quite brave of you to sit here facing four interpreters.
Does it feel a little bit like going into the lion's den?
Well, yes and no. I've not worked with interpreters as much. The reason I came in here is to try and understand the interpreter's perspective rather than a technology perspective or a buyer perspective or an end user perspective. We have always been working in parallel with interpreting companies. They've tried to see what we are doing, but always quite cautious about whether we're going to eat up their market. When we have that kind of situation where people are viewing us with certain doubt, then we're always very careful to tread. So this is really good.
Welcome to the Troublesome Terps, the podcast about the things that keep interpreters up at night. Now, my name is Alexander Gansma, and with us today is the guy who literally wrote the book on machine interpreting versus interpreters, Dr. Jonathan Downey. How are you?
Thank you, Alex. I'm fine. I am 100% non-robotic today, so I'm really pleased. And it's my pleasure to welcome the man without whom there would be no Troublesome Terps. He is like the drummer in a band, or maybe the bass guitarist.
Oh, careful there.
He's like the sound engineer at your favorite concert. This is our favorite tech guy ever, Alex Drexel.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'll take that, but careful with the bassist jokes and stuff like that. But they have a special reputation in musician circles. But it's great to be here. It's lovely to see you all.
Misunderstood.
Yeah, totally misunderstood. I know one person who's not misunderstood, and that's Sarah Hickey, who's joining us once again from Ireland. Good evening. How are you?
Thanks. Very nice introduction. And our episode today is actually going to be particularly troublesome because we're going to address the big threat of machine interpreting. Will the machines replace us? Will we learn to coexist? And what does this potential future look like? JD is our in-house expert on the topic. And to really get into the weeds of it, we invited a very special guest, the CEO of Wordly, a machine interpreting solution. Welcome, Lakshman Rathnam.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for inviting me to participate in this session. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to discussing machine interpretation today.
Fantastic. It's great to have you. Maybe we can kick this off with you telling us a little bit more about yourself first so we can get to know you a bit better.
I will keep it really short. I'm a technologist. I've worked in the Silicon Valley for over 25 years, and I worked at many companies and managed teams. I managed teams globally as well, and while managing teams globally, I always had this problem of communicating with the global teams as well. But my segue into machine interpretation came a little bit roundabout. I was working for a hearing aid company, and I was helping with the hearing impaired. And then I realized that hearing aids catered only to a minority of the people that needed hearing assistance. And I wanted to use machine interpretation or machine learning and artificial intelligence to provide them with perhaps speech to text so that it could increase cognitive load for people who could not afford hearing aids or were so hard of hearing aids that hearing aids would not help them. And then I connected this to my past and said, if you spoke a foreign language to me, I can hear you, but I can't understand you. So essentially that's what led me to looking into interpretation as a bigger market.
That's a really nice way of thinking about it.
And perhaps helping bring the world much closer.
And it has such a different vibe these days, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's what got me into this whole world of interpretation and getting people communicating across language barriers. I had no background in language or interpretation or in that industry. I'm more a technology person.
A technology person who saw a problem he wanted to fix.
That's right.
As technology people want to do.
Yeah.
The really fascinating thing about Wordly seems to be that you're pushing into markets that a lot of current machine interpreting solutions aren't really looking for. Could you tell us a bit more about who's using Wordly and what they're using it for?
I'd say, sorry to interrupt there, but maybe we can start with, for our listeners as well, what Wordly is first.
That's
maybe.
a good idea, yeah.
Yes?
Simply put, it allows any speaker to speak in their language of choice and allows any listener to listen in their language of choice if they have access to Wordly. So we use artificial intelligence and machine learning and help do interpretation without any human interference. I think that's the best way of putting it for general consumption.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Jonathan, back to your question, maybe.
Yeah, so who's using Wordly and what are they using it for?
As you can imagine, there's so many use cases for interpretation, but ours is a new paradigm. Just having machine interpretation replace where humans have service interpretation predominantly. So getting into a market is really quite difficult because it's a new paradigm. It needs people to accept it. However, having said that, we have overcome this a little bit, and our early segments have been into conferences or big events where just scaling up for interpretation, human interpretation, has been very expensive and a logistical nightmare. Having to provide sound booths, custom headsets, infrared transmitters, and at the end of the day, they're more concerned about retrieving their hardware rather than the experience that people get with interpretation. So we have found that to be a good market to validate our product. And what we're now seeing is that there's a general acceptance in the enterprise sector. And given the COVID situation, there are more people willing to accept our solution, or at least beginning to engage with us, because everything is virtual. And scaling for virtual platforms with human interpreters seems to be an issue just in general with the availability of human interpreters.
Okay.
And I think market will dictate that. Yeah.
Yep. The market dictates everything nowadays.
Exactly.
Could you explain a bit on how it works? Because I know for practicing interpreters, they look at machine interpreting and it just seems like a magic box. Could you kind of break down the basic steps that it goes through to turn spoken language in one language into another?
Perhaps the easiest way for me to do it, to explain this, is to just talk you through the flow of how the data goes through. And being a technologist, it makes sense to me, but I'm happy to answer questions after that, right? So what we do is we capture the audio of a speaker. And the important thing is to capture this in a clean fashion. So we capture it through a mobile device. Today, we are supported. We run on Android and iOS devices. So we capture the audio and then we send the audio into the cloud, our proprietary cloud, where we then do the speech recognition, ASR, and then we do the translation as well in that cloud. And what attendees can do is they get a very secure code for each session that Wordly is being set up for. They can join each of these sessions and they receive the translated text in whichever language they prefer. And then we convert that into audio for them to listen as well. And all of this is encrypted.
Yeah, so by ASR, you're meaning automated speech recognition, which is a technology that takes spoken text and turns it into written text. Is that correct?
That is correct. Okay. Basically, what it does is it takes words and it breaks it into phonemes. Mm-hmm. And then AI, the way it does is that it recognizes phonemes and it understands it comes up with the highest probability of what that word should mean in that language.
It's extremely fascinating. I've looked into that a little bit, but the whole sort of way this works and how it splits up the waveform basically into different chunks and tries to put them together is super fascinating. Yeah,
it is fascinating, and it's fascinating to compare that with the little bits that we know about interpreter cognition as well. But I'm not going to go into that yet. We'll cover that later.
Maybe just a little bit.
Well, okay. One of the things that has fascinated me about machine interpreting is that the underlying model that you've described has a label. So in interpreting research, we call it the conduit model. And it's interesting because the more interpreting research has gone on, the further away from the conduit model researchers have gone. Especially it started off in interpreting in, say, medical settings or in court settings even. And actually, as time has gone on, we've realized that the conduit model explains some things really well, but doesn't explain things like why interpreters choose this word over that one, or why they choose this phrasing over that one, or how they manage to self-correct. And so it's fascinating to see machine interpreting using a model of interpreting which has really been questioned and challenged since the 1990s in research, and to see what the results are of using the conduit model to do machine interpreting versus the model that most interpreters are trained in now, which is called the triad model, which is more about cooperation and understanding what's going on in the situation rather than concentrating on what did that person just say. And it's fascinating to see the difference in how the tech world understands interpreting versus how the interpreting research world understands interpreting.
This might be very out there, but is it fair to say that the conduit model is a bit like the cascade model? Like the standard or the old model of ASR, if you will?
Yes. Well, it's
just in the way that it's chronological, I guess, or sort of in-out.
Kind of. It's more like the best analog to the conduit model is the ASR to machine translation to spit the audio out at the end. That is classic. That is the conduit model in a nutshell. So it was the interpreter hears, they process, they say. And it was always the only thing the conduit model ever dealt with was the language. And so there have been lots of studies since the 1970s on how do interpreters chunk, how do interpreters turn phonemes into words, how do interpreters turn words into sentences, how do they know when a sentence is finished, and so on and so forth. And I believe in German that's very difficult because sentences in German never end.
No idea what you're talking about.
But this is, it's one of the things, and especially actually German's been a really useful way of studying that because with it being verb final so often and negation final.
Negation final, yes.
Negation final as well. So this is where the conclusion that researchers have come to since the 90s is that interpreters are using their social awareness and their world knowledge as much as they are the language that they're hearing. And it's interesting because when you gave us a demo of Wordly before this, my brain was going, I can see the conduit model working. You can actually trace issues of, it's that word because that's the right conduit model word, but an interpreter would never choose that word because we would have context. And it's just fascinating to see the different models working. I wonder, out loud, we might come to this conclusion at the end, but I wonder if the two models mean that the two solutions are good for different things.
I tend to agree that there are areas where machine interpretation exists and there are areas where human interpreters will exist. When I look at the big picture, this is how I see it in the long term. Perhaps short term is very different, but if you look at any piece of conversation, you can break them down into two areas. One is the emotional content of that speech, and the second is the information context of that speech. And we believe that today, or for the long term, the information content, machine learning is ready for this. However, the emotional content cannot be captured as easily because just the way that people behave, it's so varied depending on region, depending on personality, what kind of emotion they bring into their speech. Even their tonality, the way they speak, is very different from person to person, and it's very hard for AI to capture that in a large platform. So I think that's where there's a limitation today.
Does your system capture intonation data as well? Because I know that was a limitation of a lot of systems, is that they would capture word level data, but they wouldn't capture things like emphasis or kind of intonation switches that humans tune into and go, or he's being ironic, she's being sarcastic, or she's trying to be funny.
I think there's a way to do it. We're not there yet. That is not too far off in my sense, but sarcasm is going to be really hard because sarcasm, again, that depends from person to person, right? I think this will be the biggest challenge. You can do it on a personal basis, but doing it on a broad scale is going to be very challenging. The hard part is you may get it 60% right, 70% right, but for general acceptance in the market, you have to have it 90, 95% right. And margin for error there is much lower than what people think.
I just have a quick follow-up question. Following up on what Jonathan just said on you can see the machine think or change things according to how the sentence develops. As far as I can tell, a lot of machine translation systems or speech translation systems actually show you the transcription result in the original language. And Wordly, if I remember correctly, doesn't do that. Was there any... Why did you decide not to do that? I suppose the others do it for transparency, or I don't know. Why did you decide to go a different route, I think?
Our way of doing this thing was to make sure that from a human behavioral model, people don't have time to look at two transcripts and follow the conversation at the same time. And when you look at our product, it's meant for continuous conversation. And the way we have designed our product is to make sure that you can have a continuous conversation without having like if you had an interpreter in between who was doing sequential interpretation, right? Then I have to speak a sentence, wait, and then let the other person speak. What we're doing is to make sure that there's a seamless interaction between people. Now, when you do that, there's no point in showing two languages to the other person. However, what we do is when I'm speaking, let's say I'm using Wordly and I'm speaking, I can see what I am speaking as a transcription. And what that allows me to do is that when I see something that is transcribed that is incorrect, then I can almost predict for 100% that the translation is going to be incorrect.
It's trouble ahead.
And
yeah.
so I can repeat what I said, so the translation comes out correctly.
Plus, what you were saying as well with not showing both, the original and the translation for, let's say, the person who receives it. I would say that, yes, for us analysts, maybe that's interesting if I can see English and German, or for interpreters. But let's say if I'm attending a conference that is in, I don't know, Swahili, it's not of no use to me to see the script. I mean, it might be interesting just to see what kind of words come up in that language, but it's not like I can do a comparison anyway. And then I just want to understand what's being said, right?
Yep. So it's one of the bigger things with interpreting that we don't think about enough, is the fact that if interpreters are being called or machine interpreting is being used, it's because people don't understand one of the languages.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, no, but this is a fundamental thing, and it is one that we forget so easily, is that there's two things. One, there's a relation of trust, of implicit trust, that we should never take for granted. And two, without some kind of solution, there isn't really a lot. There's physical communication, which kind of happens, but the real communication isn't going to take place unless there's some solution there. And I think once we understand that, we can understand things like quality judgments. We can understand why some clients, even for a big conference, would say, we just want machine interpreting. Rather than saying, how horrible you are, it's like, well, put yourself in their shoes and look at the problem that they've got. And actually, that solution might make sense for some conferences. For others, it definitely won't. There are certain meetings where I imagine that they would. In fact, I've been in meetings where they call human interpreters because it's a prestige thing. So, it's horses for courses.
I totally agree. I think that human behavior, again, going back to human behavior, this prestigious, there are people that like the entourage. For the high level meetings, they like to go with their interpreters. And that also allows them to break the conversation and discuss internally and gives them a thought process. We believe that level of dynamics will exist and continue to exist in the future because that's a mode of business operation. In general, I think there are more meetings that are happening today that would need informational interpretation. And I think that's where machine interpretation is going to perhaps take a bigger, it may not eat up the revenue, but it'll definitely have some penetration in those areas.
That's exactly the question, right? What's the overlap and how's it going to play out? Yeah, that's the interesting bit that we don't know yet.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like, so when I started, I first translated before I interpreted, and I got a few documents that I translated and they were labeled for information only. I don't know if anyone else has come across stuff like that.
Traduction de courtoisie.
Yeah. Oh, seriously. Is for information only, or the other one which we dealt with in class, and I had one and it was annoying, was translation for the file. But that kind of stuff, translation for the file, interpreting that's just, you need to know this. So long as it's not information that's going to get anyone killed if it goes wrong, it makes sense to have a machine. Where it's, life or death, profit or loss, where there's some danger in error, then I think people will probably go for humans. But this is, again, a whole conversation to have is, and we didn't even have this in the notes, Lakshman, traditionally, conference interpreters interpreters in general have been quite scared and seen machine interpreting as a rival. And some of the PR from the speech translation community hasn't been encouraging in that regard. There's been a lot of talk of replacing interpreters in 5 years there'll be no more humans left. Is there anything you would want to say to that controversy? What would you want to calm interpreters down? Would you want to get us anxious, to make us, interpret better? What would your input to that controversy be?
No pressure, right?
Well, let me put it this way. I empathize with their concern. But I believe that the market is really big for both to coexist. And here's what my research has shown. Interpreters are very hard to come by, just by nature of the business. If I am in Middle America and I need a good interpreter in a language, I need to fly them in from either the East Coast or the West Coast, or they're just hard to find. I mean, that's nature of the business. The industry by itself, interpretation industry, is fragmented, and if you don't have a platform to unfragment this, it is going to be very difficult. And what that will lead to at the end of the day is that more and more people will not use interpreters, which we actually see only 15% of the meetings that actually need translation are using interpreters. There's a long tail where they don't use it. They just get by with body language or repeat meetings or whatever it is. It just affects productivity. That's the biggest worry, right? Is that the long tail languages, if you want to preserve them in the long run, you need to, otherwise the dominant languages will just take up. And then people's identity will be lost in these participation. And that is a bigger picture that people have to look at than just look at it as interpretation as, I don't want to trivialize it, but not just look at interpretation as a source of income, but how do we look at the bigger picture and preserve languages? I think that is a bigger picture one has to look at.
And I would add to that in addition to preserving languages, in the end, all about providing language access. And like you said already, that in some scenarios or in some locations, this can be extremely challenging or next to impossible. I also think that there's definitely scenarios where, people right now, they won't get interpreters either because they can't or they can't afford it. So something like machine interpreting can actually, I think, also open up the market even further. It's already a big market. with lots that's left unfilled, and it might open up even more fields for interpreting and for language access because it's possible this way.
That's what I was thinking too. I'm thinking a lot of those meetings that can be then interpreted with machine interpreting, if more people see it more of the time, it could also help raise awareness just generally for the need and for the demand that is out there in the meetings, which would then in turn also potentially benefit human interpreters.
This is a case that I've been making, and more recently. There was a video that I brought out about 4 months ago called "No, Mr. Robot, You Can't Have My Job, but You Can Help Me Do It Better." It did fairly well. It got a couple of hundred views, and the interesting thing about that is people all latched onto the "You can't have my job" bit, and no one latched onto the "But you can help me do mine better" bit. One of the use cases for machine interpreting, which I think has been underexplored and undervalued, is to use the same technology that underlies machine interpreting and use it to make human interpreting more accurate by doing things like speeding up terminology searches. So when an interpreter's working simultaneously, we work in teams of 2 or 3 if you're fancy, and there's often an interpreter doing the terminology searches for the one who's active, because when you're active, you don't have the time often be able to get a term. And there's no reason why this technology couldn't be repurposed to say, well, that term I recognize isn't in the top 10,000 words in English. I'll check your terminology database, and if not, I'll check the ones that I know you search. And that's every IT person that I've talked to said, yeah, the technology exists to do that. And my response has been, well, we need it, because that's the kind of thing where you can get the two sides working together and benefiting each other. And I'm sure from the data of, the terms that interpreters look up most often, or how interpreters use machine interpreting, that can improve machine interpreting output too, especially on the language recognition side. And there's scope for rivalry, and we should never deny that, but there's also scope for cooperation.
Like I said, I agree with you. I think they both need to coexist. And I mean, what you said is quite accurate, is that we can feed off of each other, right? Human interpretation and machine interpretation. The more human interpreters use machine interpretation to improve their quality or their delivery of interpretation, it only speeds up their interpretation and it reduces the cognitive load on them. And what that can help on the AI side of this equation is their inputs can actually make the algorithms much better and provide better outputs or better translation quality that can improve machine translation. So I think that they can help each other out. And at some point, I just don't see the scaling for human interpreters being as many, just given the nature. I just think that this human interpreters don't scale to the global requirements that where interpretation is needed today.
But that's also kind of related to specific languages, or would you say that's something that's a trend across the board, or is that something that you see specific to certain languages or language groups, maybe? The scalability and availability?
Of course, the availability of interpreters for long-tail languages are fewer and fewer. And that's why even now, today, conferences, they probably do translation for 1 or 2 languages, not just the expense, but they just are not able to get the interpreters for the long-tail languages. I think that over time, the long-tail languages, there's not enough data today for the long-tail languages to have presence both in human interpreters as well as machine interpretation today, but I think it'll catch up soon.
Yeah, and I think just following up on that, the languages that you have available, I suppose, are also constrained by the availability of training data and material to feed the algorithm, as it were.
Absolutely. I mean, that's by nature of the quality of machine learning. We just need more data sets to be able to do it. The second thing that we are also focused on right now, at least being an early stage company, is we focus more on business case. it's easier for us. We can get the data for long tail languages, but it's all a return on investment and where we put effort and how we prioritize it.
Yeah, I mean, what differentiates what you're doing from the solutions offered by, say, Google or Waverly Labs or the other people in the same space?
Yeah, so one of the key things that we do is, and as you saw in the demo earlier, is we do what we call the continuous translation. Number one, I can continue speaking, and it translates in real time. What we do also is that we translate from one language to multiple languages. We don't require special hardware. You don't need a special headset or a special earpiece to listen to the translation. Your mobile device is good enough. Your computer is good enough. We make it super easy. You don't have to be in the same physical location. You can be virtual. And I think, and our quality at the end of the day, we have to say is quite reasonable, or the delivery, depending on the language pairs that we use, is fairly good.
No, I just had a very practical question, because on your website it says that you're offering it for, among other things, global meetings, conferences, and briefing centers. And then in the demo that we saw, it was obviously just you talking. So it was basically all just continuous chat bubbles, if you will, with your text. So if you were to be in a meeting and let's say you and I have a conversation, would the view then adapt? Or because you're doing this continuous and seamless stream of speech, if you will, like, does it all show up just, as one kind of blob of speech bubbles? Or do you do like literally like a chat view where like I say something and then you say something and it shows?
So what I showed you earlier today was one speaker and many listeners. So it's a one-to-many mode. And we do support the many-to-many as well. So if you and I are speaking, if you had the application on your side and I had the application, so what you would see on the screen is it would show Lakshman, it would put a small initial bubble and say, this is what I spoke. And then it'd say, Alex spoke this. And so, we'd have the different breakdown by the speaker who spoke, and with a small initial next to that. But if I had to see it, I will see only what is being said in my language that I choose. Whereas if you had to, let's say you're listening in German, then you would see everything in German and be able to hear everything in German.
Does it label changes of speaker? So if it's just continuously doing the same language, does it say, this speaker said this speaker said that?
That is correct. We do a speaker breakdown on that.
So do they then, so if you've got a standard conference setup where, you could have three speakers who all speak using the same microphone, say you have three speakers back to back who speak three different languages, does it auto-detect language, or does it have to manually change, okay, this is so-and-so, he's speaking Hindi?
Yeah. So today, we have the technology to do auto-detect. But today, what we do is we do it manually. That's what we have in the market product today. That they have to switch it manually.
Okay, and then would someone manually label? This is a new speaker, but they're using the same. This is Bob, this is Sarah, this is Phil.
Typically, in the conference, what we do is there are multiple outputs to the microphone channels. So we use different channels for different speakers, and so it's automatically labeled. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Because one of the things that you often have at conferences is you'll get speaker after speaker on the same podium, and interpreters have tricks of the trade that we use to make sure that someone's. The nightmare for us, I wouldn't say nightmare. It's actually quite fun. Is when you get an open forum or a QA session, or you get a panel session. So I had one a couple of years ago. I was interpreting from the Scottish Parliament. And it was the Consul General of France, the French Consul General to Scotland, was interviewing a very famous French-speaking musician. And they're doing the interview entirely in French, and I'm interpreting entirely in English. And I had to very quickly come up with a solution so that people knew who said what and when. And now, that's the thing, as a professional, I would expect, I'm a consultant interpreter, so if I've got interpreters in my team, I would know that they would know how to cope, because I would expect I would only get the people who would know how to cope. But I'd imagine with machine interpreting, you would maybe have to pre-label the mics, or you would have to have a very good person sitting going, this person, that person, this person, that person.
Right, but that's why I asked that question as well. And as Lakshman was saying, if you and I have the conversation, or if multiple microphones are being used on stage, you can simply pre-label that, or the device tells you anyways. And that's also that's why I asked that question as well, because if you're having a conversation, or if you're having an interview or a panel discussion, you need to, as a human interpreter, you need to use those tricks of the trade to make sure that people can differentiate. Whereas with machine interpretation, at least if you look at the transcript, you can simply label them, and it's dead easy.
Yeah, and which is what we do, right? I mean, that the hard part is labeling the Q&A part, and that is hard, but we typically call that as a guest, right? And which is what perhaps human interpreters do, is they say audience. This is the audience, that's question from the audience, and just don't label the person.
We have to keep some tricks up our sleeve.
That's right. But just a quick follow-up question on that, because I'm guessing not everybody always follows the transcript. Some people, when they're at a conference, they also just want to listen to the speech synthesis. So if, I don't know, you and Jonathan and Sarah, you guys, the three of you are in a panel discussion, and I'm not following the transcript, is there a change of voice? Because I saw in the demo you could also choose between 3 different voices.
We have choice for different languages and different voices. So you can pick different voices. You can and different languages come out with different voices. So you can definitely tell if you're listening to people. Then let's say I'm listening in Hindi, and it'll come out, of course, it'll come out in one voice, but you can, but it'll be labeled as different voices. Yeah, I see your point. That's a good idea for us to change.
Alex, stop it.
I like that.
Sorry.
I like that. That's a good idea for us to implement. That's awesome.
But I mean, this is the thing as well. So where I would quite happily turn to machine interpreting is, I wrote once about the kind of people that you meet at a conference, and all the interpreters in this room are going to nod when I say this. When the chair of the session says, "Does anyone have any questions?" and there's a rambler in the audience with a typewritten script that doesn't have any questions on it, that no one actually needs to understand, because it's more of a comment. Always a man. It's always a man. I don't know why it's always a man. They always have size 8 typed script, and just as you think they're finished, they hold the papers up, and what they do, they tap the papers on the table, then they turn them around and start from the back. And in those situations, when they're just speaking for the sake of speaking, it'd be nice to have a button on the console that goes, "Machine can take that one."
I think the hard part are the similarities between machine translation and human translation interpreters is very similar, right? In this part, at least. So if the speaker is unintelligible, a human interpreter finds it hard to translate. And the same is true for machines as well. If they can't understand, if the machine can't understand what the speaker is saying, it's just going to be that much harder for us to recognize as well. And we fail in this, garbage in, garbage out. Yeah.
Yeah.
That does remind me, I launched a challenge which no machine interpreting company has ever taken me up on, and that is to pit machine interpreting live against remote human interpreters and human interpreters in the room, and to do a double blind test where the audience it would be single blind really, the audience don't know which is which, but they're free to just switch between them on specially rigged up, where they could use them on mobile phones right now. The text there that they could just do on a mobile phone. So every channel is unlabeled, and the humans just scroll through and they just get asked afterwards what they thought. But of course, if you're going to do that, you have to make it as like a real conference as possible, and I am a crazy Glaswegian, so I might get some crazy Glaswegian there.
You're going to invite your fisherman from Aberdeen or Inverness or whatever it was.
So Lakshman doesn't know this story. I've done a few deep sea fisheries policy meetings, And the first or second one I did, the chair, who was a very senior civil servant in the Scottish government, came up to me and said, "Are you two Scots?" And because there were two of us, because we're proper professionals, and I was like, "Yeah, we're both Scots." He said, "Great, we've got Aberdonian fishermen here, and I don't understand a word they're saying. Can I listen to the French instead?" And for Scots, I mean, there was two Scots in the booth that day. We were completely fine with it, and my booth mate even managed to do a nice little interpreting from Gaelic, because the guy decided to open the meeting in Gaelic. Thanks. We just went with it, and it was fine. But one fisherman at one point leant back in his chair away from the microphone and said, "I didn't want to come across like neat, but what's that?" And we interpreted it no problem, but you could see all the English speaking delegates going, "What was that?"
Yeah. But just at the risk of giving you more free ideas, I'm wondering if you're also looking in other sort of related services, I guess, because there's so much attention on machine translation oftentimes that the other services or things that NLP can do get sort of overlooked, like, just transcription, just monolingual transcription, and I don't know, emotion extraction or extracting to-do items, stuff like that. Is that something you're looking at, or is that still too far away, or maybe not interesting for you?
No, definitely. I mean, adding additional information into interpretation just adds value, right? I mean, that it is something that we have looked at. So the first part of it is, how do you extract or do a summary, and how do you extract keywords? And then with those keywords, how do you actually provide, some sentiment? And people have talked a lot about sentiment analysis, but the key to getting the right sentiment is to have context behind the conversation, and then use that context to then derive the sentiment. And since we would have the data in different languages, it's easy for us to do something like this. So these are natural paths for us as a future to be able to provide to companies. So yeah, definitely in our roadmap.
To go into something a little different again there, or actually pick up something from a little earlier, Lakshman, you were saying that with AI and technology, you can only really be successful once you have once the quality is at something like 99%, right? So it's just I've spent a bit of time at NIMSY as well, of course, as you know, looking into machine interpreting, and we spend as a company a lot of time on AI. On all the technologies in our industry that come with that. And a question popped up there for me as well. It's just like, what do we want from AI in the end? And what are our expectations that we have towards AI and towards humans? Because we always make the comparison, of course, AI and humans. And whereas for humans, we say, well, it's only human to make mistakes, right? But for AI, you don't have that. People don't make that excuse. It's more like it has to be perfect or it doesn't work. It's like there's very little leeway, I think, that we're giving.
There's some bias there, huh?
Yeah.
There is some bias there. So there are a few errors that machines do, let's put it this way. Neither of the interpretation schemes are 100% accurate. Humans are not 100% accurate. Machines are not 100% accurate. So today, what machines do, and I'm not so much in the interpreter space, so I want you guys are more experts on these, and I can ask some questions on that. But the machines, the biggest error is all driven by the human speaker. So let me put it this way: if I am speaking generally, people speak in phrases. People don't speak in complete sentences. Now, when they speak in complete sentences, the recognition and the machine translation works really well. Now, when they speak in phrases, it works well as well. Now, if they speak grammatically incorrect sentences, then machine translation has a big problem. And then if I speak something and then I change my sentence mid-sentence, I correct myself. Human interpreters do really well in that area. We just don't do so well. And the biggest thing for machine interpretation is proper names, right? So people's names are very hard to come by. I mean, and people have names like summer and winter that have meanings and so on. So all that gets literally translated. And over time, I think that's where we are today. I think some of these can change over time, and we can add glossaries and we can bias the output for it to be a noun versus something else and not translate it. So there are things that we can do some magic on the back end, but those are areas that are the similarities and the differences between human interpretation. But the question I have for all of you is, how do you measure quality of human interpreters today? Some are good, some are not good. And then how can we then equate that to machine interpretation, not by just saying machine interpretation is not acceptable?
Please stop stumbling into stuff I'm doing research on. Please.
Really good question.
We'll cut you off, Jonathan.
Okay,
it's fine.
Let's say first, because I am going to rant.
I was just going to say that. Yes.
Actually, I was just recently asked by Renato, our CEO at Nimdzi, also like, how do people get tested for interpreting, or how do you check interpreting quality? And I think it was also something, I forgot the context, but with how you can do it fairly quickly or something, or who checks interpreters on the market? How do you check their quality output? And it's like you kind of don't, And I was saying that at institutions, there's the head of booth who checks in maybe with the interpreters every now and again and all that, or listens in, and then you just have your qualification at the beginning, where lots of people check. One just listens to the output, and the others listen to both, and all this kind of stuff. But even there, it's still, of course, very subjective. Even though it might be very high level, it's still also subjective. And that's why I think in general, this is something we talk about a lot at Nimdzi when it comes to quality of both interpreting or translation. There is no definite quality standard. And and it doesn't exist, and everyone keeps saying, Renato keeps saying, like, quality doesn't matter because everyone says they have the best quality. It's not that it actually doesn't matter, but it's not a differentiator, right? Because if you ask in a room, how do who here provides the best quality, everyone's going to raise their hand.
Yeah. So then if we say we are the best interpreter, how do you then take machine interpretation and say machine interpretation is just, I can claim today that we have best interpretation quality. Does that, how do we measure it?
Right, I will give you a quick, and I promised Alex D I will be quicker, otherwise he will edit me out in post. Okay, two things. The standard quality measurements for machine translations, so I can't remember what they're called, Meteor and the Blue Score. They are highly Andy Way, who's a machine translation expert, will explain very clearly why they're highly problematic. There has been lots of research on quality and interpreting. Basically the best we can get to at the moment is quality is almost entirely to do with context. So instead of talking about quality, I talk about, in both of my books, I talk about adding value. And I ask the question, and this is a good question to ask both for machine interpreting and for human interpreting.
Mm-hmm.
What difference did interpreting make that wouldn't have happened if interpreting wasn't there? And then then the next question is, what risks were there that were either made worse or were mitigated by the interpreting? That's a new one that I've been working on. So, for example, quality in medical interpreting at its base level is the patient didn't die unnecessarily and they got the right treatment. That's what quality comes down to. Quality, if you've got a really artistic speaker, comes down to, did the audience experience it as well as the source language audience? So it's a really dangerous area to get into, but I would counsel anyone doing machine interpreting or automatic speech translation, as I'm now calling it because of conduit model, I would counsel anyone in that space to either talk to guys like Andy Way, who are creating new machine translation quality measurements, or to be very careful about how they use the Q word and stay away from quality and talk about use cases. I would rather we talk use cases than quality, but I have devised a quality test that we can try out, which is to put them against each other.
No, well said. I mean, that's exactly what our platform is as well. Is, at the end of the day, do we add value? And if we did not have interpretation, do people walk away from having understood nothing, or with the interpretation, did they walk away having understood something? And is there a net gain? And I think even in medical use cases, machine interpretation is actually perhaps relevant, because most doctor-patient interactions, doctors typically ask the same question 5 to 10 different ways to make sure that they are actually coming to the right conclusion. If they say if you go and say, I have a headache, they ask, is it your left side? Oh, when I touch here, does it pain? So they ask the question 10 different ways to make sure that the answer is correct, or their conclusions are what they think it is. And the same can happen with machine interpretation, is they're already trained to do something like that. Of course, we don't want to get into a case where they're going into the surgery room or asking, is it right leg that I need to take off, right eye, left eye, when they're doing surgery. But there are areas of the medical profession where machine interpretation will work, and there are perhaps areas where we do need human interpreters.
So I have a follow-up question on what you just said, because you said the doctors usually have 5 to 10 different ways of asking a question. And I think this harkens back to something, I forgot who said it earlier, but I think it was about I think it was actually you, Lakshman, who said about the names, summer and winter. And I know, for example, for a lot of the dictation software out there, like Dragon or whatever have you, you can prime it. So you can actually say, okay, we're going to be doing a dictation on automotive engines. Here are the main words that you need to know. And then you type it into the program and you basically prime the software. Is that something that you guys can do as well, or that you're doing already? So if you're having a meeting on, I don't know, who knows, whatever, on my new iPad, can you prime it on my iPad terminology?
So yeah, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is one of the things we've done is we have built our models are built on very big knowledge base, so broad base. So what we then typically ask is that if you have domain-specific acronyms, especially many companies now have acronyms for different things.
We know.
Yes, and acronyms are very hard to recognize. So we ask for acronyms. We ask for names that are unique, such as Wordly. Corporate names that are Atlassian, or that are not in the dictionary, product names that come up. And we ask for all of that, and we actually create a special dictionary for that particular session. And then we can build it for that particular domain and company. We can continue to build on that for them. So that's how we do it for domain-specific or company-specific requirement.
That makes a ton of sense. We do the same thing.
Yeah, I totally want to see the machine interpreting challenge with Wordly now.
Well, actually, Jonathan, I was going to add, since you're saying that you wouldn't tell participants what voice belongs to which scenario, but I think for now, at least with the machine interpreting solutions, they're mostly still very synthetic voices. Like you can understand them, but but it doesn't mean the solution doesn't work, Yeah. So I think.
Well, there's been, going back to quality, there has been quite a bit of research on voice quality and interpreting. And my argument always is you take the situation as is and you give it a try as is. And I think there are some cases, I was talking to people recently about kind of emergency service interpreting, or, tourists going to a library in a foreign country. There are situations where, if an ambulance, if a paramedic needs to get a patient's name and work out where it's sore, use whatever solution lets them do triage, and then when they're actually getting treated, you get the right solution for the time. So yeah, I would like to test things as is, because I know technologists well enough that the more feedback that you get and the more that you can see it out in the wild and people reacting to it, the more you can make a difference. And also the more human interpreters can adjust. I think we've given human interpreters far too easy a ride for far too long. And chapters 10 to 13 of my book are a well-deserved poke. And I think if human interpreters don't get a well-deserved poke with what machine speech translation can do, then I think they deserve to get in trouble. If we take it as, okay, this is this thing, this is what it can do, here's how we need to differentiate ourselves. If we react the right way, it could be good for everyone. If we react the wrong way, it's our own dumb fault.
Jonathan, you should send me a link to your book after this session. I'm curious to read it now.
Just, you have to promise me that you don't get annoyed for my simplification of how the computer models work, because
I love simplicity. That is perfect. I love simplicity. Yeah.
I drew a diagram. Oh,
that was you who drew it.
I believe all of the diagrams are hand drawn because copyright permissions are hard. Don't go there.
I want to talk about one of the things that you brought up earlier, Jonathan. So we did have a conference where there was a human interpreter for certain languages, and they use Wordly as well. And I'm not going to tell you which conference this was, or it was, but it was a big conference. There were a lot of people attending. Then what they did during that session was something that was very revealing to us. Number one is the organizers were able to audit us in real time. And they were able to audit the quality in different languages. They were asking, hey, how is this interpretation coming? How is it good? The second thing is that for the buyer who's buying or purchasing the interpretation, they're able to see real time how many people are actually using our product in real time, in what languages that they're using, and so the openness and the ability to audit in real time is quite unique with machine interpretation. With human interpretation, they didn't seem to be able to tell how many people actually use the headsets, or how many are actually currently using it in real time, or did they just take it, or how many people did not take it. And it was just they were not able to provide the metrics.
These are metrics that on the IR systems you can't get, but on the newer, so there is now interpreting into delivering the human interpreting into mobile apps. There's no reason why the metrics shouldn't be available there. And I think this again is a kind of poke for human interpreters, is that we're not used to thinking metrics. And yet there are some very important metrics that we should be thinking about. And so I was thinking, a side-by-side comparison with the same language with all the metrics available, and, the technology to transcribe what the interpreters are saying, that's widely available. That's on my phone. I can do that just about. It stumbles with Glaswegian sometimes. But, as well as an interpreter, I'm an independent researcher in interpreting studies. And the biggest issue with interpreting studies historically has been access to data. And so if we can find a way of getting access to data and getting these kind of metrics, I know researchers who would love to get their hands on that kind of data, because it would make our lives a whole lot easier. But I say that as someone who's currently writing a paper questioning some of the issues with transcribing and interpreting. But we'll get to that on another show.
And Jonathan, actually, I wanted to come back to something you said earlier. You were mentioning this, I think, really, really good example of, for example, using machine interpreting for that triage situation in emergency situations in hospitals, just for that initial bit of information. And then afterwards, maybe for the consultation, you get a human interpreter in. And Lakshman, this brings me to a question for you again about where you see like the main use cases for machine interpreting and where for humans now in real life? I know you already made the difference between the emotional stuff and the information, but like if we apply this, where do you see those like niches that maybe machine interpreting fills versus humans?
If you look at high density cities, especially for hospitals. I mean, I'll come back to the case of the hospitals, right? And even with the COVID situation that we have currently going on today, people are trying to find interpreters for patients, and having to call an interpreter to do even the initial triage or the initial consultation before going for further treatment, they're finding it to be a very logistical challenge. The second part of it is quite expensive. I mean, if you try and call through in the US, AT&T offers, you can call into an interpreter, language interpreter at any time, but it's quite expensive. There's a minimum 15-minute or a 30-minute requirement for any of that. So that we want to be able to make it easier for the patients as well as the doctors, because their time is quite valuable. I think there's a place where all of this can be done seamlessly with machine interpretation. And given what Alexander said just earlier, if we keep terminologies to, okay, this is a pediatric environment, this is a cardiac environment, this is a pulmonology environment, we can even narrow down the scope in that to provide a better ability to interpret. And the nice thing is that may be an overkill, because when you talk doctor-patient conversation, doctors are typically conversing with patients in a very simple language. They're not talking domain-specific language. They're talking general speak. And for that, we don't need to go into a big corpus requirement.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because I always think of, these for like medical interpreting, and also legal, of course. Maybe for legal it's more applicable, but like for medical interpreting, it's like, oh my God, the terminology that comes with this, the potential terminology anyway. But yes, it's very true that when that might be true for, doctors talking to each other, but when it comes to the doctor-patient conversation, of course, they have to break it down for you, the layman. And so it's fairly simple language then in comparison.
That is correct.
I guess then the only difficulty that you have left, and it's one I watched, I coached some sign language interpreters who were working with the health service for a few months. And when they were doing their coaching and working with someone, they found that the cultural aspect becomes then more important than the terminology. So in some cultures, a male doctor examining a female patient just is not done. And it's very difficult. It's easy enough for a human interpreter to interrupt and explain. It's much more difficult to set up a machine to realize, oh, hold on a minute, I see a man, I see a woman, I know this culture, that's not going to work. It's the difference between the text and the context.
Right, but also, I mean, in that scenario, right, you're probably looking at the consultation, whereas we were, for example, in the example we mentioned, it was more the initial diagnosis with a triage situation, and you could bring in a human in later, even though I guess some of it could be done by machines later too in consultations.
But Jonathan, what if you don't have access to an interpreter? What do you do in such situations? It's not always the case. While there's mandate for people to have interpreters in hospitals, there have been situations where they don't allow. I mean, they're just not available. The second part, I'll give you a little bit of a personal experience. There are cultural issues where the patient, if they don't know the language, they don't speak back to the doctor because they just don't know what is being said, right? And they may understand what the doctor is saying in English. And case in point is my mother. She understands English. She doesn't speak English so well. But so when she has to explain to the doctor, she doesn't give the full explanation to the doctor because, she has the conversation, she listens, and she doesn't question back. But if she were speaking to the doctor in Tamil, which is her language, she would definitely be able to like speak up and be able to question. And so if you had an interpreter available all the time, or if you had a machine interpreter, either a machine or a human, I think that conversation could be much freer.
And I think that's the thing, is it's challenging interpreting to look at access issues and to say, well, if there aren't interpreters nearby, a machine is going to be far better than nothing in every situation. And I think that the sooner we admit that, and the sooner we say, well, if we don't want to lose a percentage of medical interpreting, then training is our issue. It's not the job of AI to say, oh, we'll hang back until you get enough interpreters trained. That's not feasible.
No, and then you have the market element as well, and the language access element. And I also, like, I had an experience, I think I mentioned this before. I was in the hospital in Spain when I was on vacation and had to go to the emergency room. And even though I speak some Spanish, it is not nearly good enough to go to the emergency room with that. I was really out of it as well. I was way too dehydrated, and I wish I would have had some kind of a device, like a machine interpreting device, to at least help me along in that situation to get a little bit more of what the doctors were saying, and vice versa, because there was nobody who would even speak English in the emergency room. I had to wait until like the next day for someone to speak English to me. So, I got by. They treated me really well. I cannot complain at all about the Spanish system. It was fantastic, the care they gave me, but I could not communicate with them. And so it was a bit frightening in the beginning.
Yeah, this is true, especially in big cities, and in Silicon Valley, where this is close to home for me. But every region of the world is represented here, and getting access to interpreters for different languages from across the world, for sure, it's easier to get the most used languages like Spanish and English and perhaps French, but the other languages are much harder to come by, to find interpreters who are qualified to do medical interpretation.
Absolutely. I have an article coming out about this next week from NIMSI, looking at the number of languages spoken in the US and how many languages we looked at interpreter certifications, and most certifying bodies only provide certifications for like 20 languages, or I think for translators it's about 30. But there's like hundreds, 350 something languages being spoken. So there's a big gap there. Yeah.
I can see Alex D going, it's time to take the puppy to bed.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking I think we've covered the big question. I think we could certainly go on for a lot longer. But, maybe we can follow up on that. What I thought was interesting is that we're basically revisiting the topic that we had in our very first episode, which Lakshman, it was called Dictionary on Legs, and we were sort of riffing on
very first episode
what the situation back then was in machine translation. And I think this was when the Waverly Labs pilot first came out, I think, or was about to come out or whatever. So yeah, it's been really interesting to come back to that. Also, in light of recent developments, shall we say? So it's probably not a good idea to talk about what the future will bring, because nobody saw coronavirus coming.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if we can really say what's going to happen next. I don't know. Unless you want to share anything cool you're working on. That will...
there's not much I can say about it, unfortunately.
That's what I thought, yeah.
I think we just have to wait and see. But all I can say is that there's increased acceptance. People, you will see and hear more and more about us. And we expect this to be a good platform that will scale quite well and can coexist with human interpreters. I definitely see space for both to exist.
I think that's one of the key takeaways. Would you agree, Jonathan, as the person who literally wrote the book on this?
I would definitely agree. I would definitely agree, and I would make one appeal to interpreters. Please spend more time reading about the engineering side of speech translation and learn to distrust the marketing side. It's just standard critical thinking. And to companies who are making speech translation solutions, if you're not if you're going to say to us that you're not trying to replace us, I would beg you to say the same to journalists, especially tech journalists, because it's damaging to everyone in the short to medium term to start talking about machine interpreting taking over, because then less interpreters will train, the availability issues will get worse, and we won't have enough human interpreters to deal with the work that needs human interpreters now until the machines get a lot better. So can we please call a truce?
But gentlemen, I think the one thing to keep in mind with that is, even though I agree, is some of it is just also marketing,
There's marketing. I believe I wrote a chapter called Machine Interpreting is Marvelous but Misleading Marketing.
Yeah, of
Right.
course.
I think it's not just marketing. It's. I mean, there are just some constraints. It's, you need to raise money, you need to pay the bills, you need to invest money in research.
Yeah.
So I think it's not quite that simple, really.
And it's not entirely false to say that this solution does replace human interpreters for your event, technically, for example. Yeah, it's not false.
Yeah.
It doesn't say we'll replace them forever for every scenario.
It's not false, but I think the thing is yes, nuance marketing doesn't tend to land, we know. And, VC guys tend not to take nuance. We all know that. But I think an understanding of saying, we're looking to provide a solution for, or we can see a market gap in, is a much more honest and a much cleverer way of marketing than to say we're going to replace all interpreters, and then the very people who you might want to work with to improve your solution are just going to fold their arms and say no. So
yeah, that's a good point. You don't want to alienate interpreters because, like we said earlier, we can all benefit from one another, and it would also be nice, I think, if interpreters weren't scared of this and would rather also.
Yes.
But that's historically true, right? Is humans are always afraid of some machine or something else taking up their job. But I'll try to end with what Jonathan started, is that how can it help improve and help them do something better in their life? If it's not interpreting, maybe something else, or improve their quality of interpretation itself. I think those are the ways for people to look at it, is not look at it as a threat, but hey, look at it as something that can help them improve their quality of life as well as other people's quality of life.
So can I virtually shake hands on a truce? I'm quite happy to do a virtual truce handshake.
There you go.
I tell you what, one of these days, I'm doing a set of live interviews on my own YouTube channel. I will keep your email, Lakshman, and I will be inviting you for a live interview, because I think it's time we had a truce. And we did stuff together.
All right, super. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think this is where the technology and people meet, and that's, yes, and definitely I think there could be a good coexistence for both.
The whole coronavirus situation is leading to a lot of changes of heart, changes of mind when it comes to remote and distance interpreting already. I mean, simply out of necessity. Let's hope we can do this better next time when it comes to machine interpreting. Because there were actually quite a few parallels, and in the recent situation, you see where it got us as interpreters. It's not pretty sometimes.
Now that we learn the lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. Better to go with the times, be curious, learn about it, and see what it can do for you.